We've been playing around with the 9800X 3D for a couple weeks now, and today we're going to be looking at what is the best RAM kit that you can buy to pair with your 9800X 3D. And this is something I'm probably going to continue to explore and delve deeper and deeper into because I've seen so many claims of, hey, there was no improvement, we can't get any faster, or hey, the 6000 CL30 is as good as it's ever going to get. And I've done some preliminary testing. I got my hands on the 9600X and the 9950X before the 9800X 3D came out, and I felt like there was some potential new capability there. I feel like it's a lot easier to raise the F-clock frequency, the infinity fabric, and a few other things. So I really wanted to deep dive in and get to the bottom of, what is the best RAM kit? Can we afford to put some more speed behind these new processors? And where is the sweet spot on value? So we're going to take a look at it today. My computer remains the same. It's the 9800X 3D. I got the X870E Crosshair Hero. I got the 4090 Liquid Supreme, and then 1000 watt PSU behind it. So these are the three kits that I currently own. So all the testing that I've done, if you watch any of my other videos, I just had my original 32 gig kit that I had on my 7800 because that was kind of the go-to when DDR5 first came out. It was like, hey, 32 gigs, DDR5 6000 CL30. And that's the first kit you're going to see here. And I don't remember what I paid for it. It was definitely more expensive back then, but they go for about 105 now. The second kit that I tested is I went ahead and some people were like, hey, the 64 gigs really helps out your 1% lows. You should check it out. So I was like, maybe I am living in the past. I don't know. I felt like I was always doing okay. But I went ahead and bought a 64 gig kit. And this was really the sweet spot I was hoping would be a clear winner with the DDR5 6400 and CL30. That should be a correction there, sorry. So that's CL32 1.4 volt, and I paid $179 for that kit. I think it's gone up a little bit. I rechecked. I think it's about 185 or so, but pretty close. And then the final kit is my 48 gig kit. It's a little bit weird. Rather than being the 16 gig sticks, it's 2x24, and that's going to be DDR5 8000 CL38 1.4 volt, and that's the XTREEM series by Teamgroup. So the other two are both G.SKILL Tridents, and that's the one odd man out there with the Teamgroup XTREEM. And I bought that to do a lot of testing on the dual CCDs. And now that I've kind of got this roundup, I think I'm going to repeat this in the future, so look out for that on the dual CCD 9950X to see if the results differ at all. But I do want to point out, so I do not have the time to go through and perfect tuning of every single kit, and based off of a lot of the comments I read, I think a lot of people just turn on either Expo or XMP, and that's the end of it. So if you see these three configurations on any of my testing, that is the kit as advertised. You just turn on Expo or turn in XMP. I did play around with some other timings to try to see, like, hey, are there other kits you should potentially be buying? I did not take the time to go through and do every little sub-timing on every single configuration because I would be at it for, weeks trying to do all that testing. So I tried to see, like, hey, is there anything we're really missing? And I'll kind of point those out to you as we go. But if it's just like, hey, I don't want to mess with it at all, I just want XMP or Expo enabled, it's going to be these three configurations. And like I said, anything else, I did some minor tweaking, but not anything huge. So let's get right into the benchmarks. So the first one up, people always love to look at the AIDA64 data. So I only have the trial because I haven't. I should really purchase it from these guys, but the trial works great. So most important things I'm looking at here is the read speed because I got to get that game information loaded up, and then the latency. So right off the bat, this is just the power of actually tuning your RAM is, like I said, I'll point out if it's not just the XMP or Expo. The 64 gig kit tuned down to 6000 megahertz CL28, and this is going to be interesting with the Infinity Fabric at 2200. Not messing around with any of the sub timings at all, or no max effort here, just trying some basic stuff. That got me the best read speed, just under 70,000. And latency 67.9. So that was the best setup. The other one I tried 6400 on it, CL30, so just taking it from 32 down to 30, and that scored second best. And then technically the winner here on read speed and latency, that would be an actual XMP kit, was the 64 gig 6400 CL32. And then I get this question or comment a lot, is people have been seeing me setting my Infinity Fabric to 2200, and they're like, that math doesn't math. It should be 2133, or it should be 2000, depending on the kit. And this right here shows you in the rawest form. If you look at that right below, I tested the 6400 at 2133, and the read speed was slower, and the latency was probably within margin of error, but a little bit higher. So what I've been finding on these chips is, in a lot of scenarios, kind of maxing out your Infinity Fabric is actually helping you. And there's a couple scenarios where it's not. It's a lot of applications, they'll kind of have a tendency to like either faster frequency or lower latency or different things. But in a lot of cases, I ended up just setting 2200 because I could seemingly squeeze out a little bit more performance. So we'll keep looking at that as that goes, because that's a conversation that I find myself having constantly. So then below the 64 gig kit came in our 32 gig kit, 6000 CL30, and really, if you're just measuring the pure performance, the actual volume shouldn't matter too much. So it came in real close. And then this is also interesting. If you notice there, once again, the 2200 F clock on the 6000 CL30. I never ran it like this on my 7800, but I can run it like this on my 9800. Read speed and latency lower than if you do the 2:3 ratio with the 2000 Infinity Fabric. And then the other thing that's interesting is the 48 gig kit, the 8000 CL38. It seems that 8000 megahertz is just not fast enough to overcome the lower CL. But what's interesting is it has the biggest jump when you go to from 2000 to 2200 on the Infinity Fabric. So now, because we've left the mim clock equals u clock, and now we're divided by 2, we've got that latency penalty, but then speeding up the Infinity Fabric helped the most in that scenario. So if you do the math and run it, it's like, okay, 2200 here helped out a little bit more than 2130 there, but it's not that big of a difference. This is a pretty big jump. This is about 6000 megabytes a second or something that it's jumping there. So that's pretty significant. So if you are going to run faster RAM, you definitely want to get that Infinity Fabric moving as quickly as you can, because it's going to help you out. On the latency, it didn't really help. In fact, it was actually a little bit higher. But on the actual read speeds, it helps out. And there was a couple applications where I think that overall really made a difference. So that's just the pure performance numbers. Let's start getting into some further testing. So next up, Cinebench. It's just a good all-around CPU test. And right here up top, low latency, AMD loves it. The 64 gig down to 6000 CL28 with that 2200 Infinity Fabric, absolutely leading the way on Cinebench. Then we come in with my 32 gig kit. Obviously here it's just kind of trying to render that image. Apparently Amount of memory is not going to be a huge factor because 32 gigs right there in second place. And then once again, technically the top Expo or XMP setting would be at 64 gigs of 6400 CL32. Once again, with that Infinity Fabric higher, you lower the Infinity Fabric down, you lose a little bit of score. So 2200 is the max that I've been able to get going pretty stable, and it's been working pretty well for me. That's going to be, silicone dependent, so you got to play around with yours a little bit. But Infinity Fabric's one of those things where people always just tell you to stick to the math. But if you play around with it on your particular CPU, you might find that you can squeeze a little bit extra performance out of there. And then, unfortunately, the 8000 megahertz, the frequency is just not helping us out here. But I will point this out, is I'm willing to bet that if I did extensive testing on like a heavy memory intensive workload, I'm probably getting some errors down here running the 8000 and the 2200, because this is one of the few tests, and this is a very intensive test, where the 2200 really fell off here for the 8000. So I'm assuming that if I reloaded that configuration and did some extensive testing, I'm probably getting some errors in here, and that's why the number's falling off. So that wouldn't be a good setup anyway. We would have to go in and spend, we would have to be really committed to trying to get this kit's numbers up and trying to make this worth it. I'd probably spend several days trying to really lock in this tune, and you'd see those numbers climb, but at the end of the day, you're going to see it's not going to be worth it, and I'm not going to invest my time because it was one of the lowest performing kits, unfortunately. So next up, we start getting towards gaming, which is what everybody's looking for. We're going to go with the synthetic first. I went with Time Spy, not Extreme, just to hopefully put more load on the CPU since it's not 4K. It's just a DirectX 12 test. Once again, the 6000 CL28 with the 64 gigs came out on top. You can see here, this is what I think is interesting, is when I monitor gaming, I'm never using above 32 gigs of memory. But here we go, the 32 gigs all the way at the bottom of the stack. So apparently some people were right, and it really was hurting me. I mean, I would just monitor, my system while gaming, and I'm like, hey, I never even get close to using 32 gigs, but apparently just having a ton of surplus does something, at least in synthetic benchmarks, because, for all intents and purposes, this should be a lot closer here. It's, almost 1,000 points below. And, this is the lower latency here, and I got the higher F clock, but, it's not pure one-to-one example, but I wouldn't expect there to be that big of a difference, but who knows? All right, and then we get into the actual games. So I'll explain my logic here. Because the difference from memory is usually so small, I wanted to only use games that had baked-in benchmarks, because just small run-to-run variances could really throw it off. Counter-Strike was the only one I did that did not have a baked-in benchmark. I just loaded into a warm-up match by myself, ran a circle around DDoS2, like I always do, and that's kind of how I counted it. So interestingly enough, the 32 gig 6000 CL30 with the 2000 Infinity Fabric, which is the Expo setting on this kit, came out way ahead. Now, there might have been, potentially run-to-run variants. I almost want to throw that kit back in. Besides, I don't plan on using it, so I don't really want to throw it back in. But I almost want to run this again because this was the one outlier. Counter-Strike, this kit came way out on top. And then interestingly here, Counter-Strike, it favored this kit, and then second up, it really liked the high frequency. So here was finally the 48 gig 8000 shining, and technically the 2200 Infinity Fabric increased the 1% low by 2, probably run-to-run variance, but for all intents and purposes, I'd consider those equal. And then in last place was my Expo settings with the 64 gigabyte 6400 CL32 with the 2133F clock. So between all these kits, you can tell these three almost dead even. We've got a little bit of a lead here, but for the amount of losses the 32 gig kit was taken, I find that data a little bit interesting, but we'll continue to push. So Black Ops 6. Here's another good one. This game was an outlier compared to the other ones because it kind of shook up the standings here. So with this, the 48 gigs of 8,000 came out on top with the average tied. And then, well, technically 1% low is one lower than the 64 gig 6400. And then you got your 64 gig 6000 CL28. So here, the kit we've been seeing, that's my own custom setup with the 28. This kit's been destroying on everything, but here we go seeing Black Ops 6 clearly favoring a little bit more speed. But, you know, we're talking average is almost the same and about 9 frames on the 1% lows. So we're still talking small beans, but that's the way it fell out. Cyberpunk 2077. Here we go once again with the low latency 6000 CL28 coming out on top. Then our actual XMP kit, the 6432 coming out second. And then the 8000. And then in last place, the 32 gigs 6000 CL30. So once again, in this scenario, seeing how this game likes the low latency, it's got to be that 32 gigs versus the higher amount holding it up, which once again I find very interesting because I don't ever see the RAM usage going that high, but that's the only thing that would make sense to me. So the last two games I included because I thought they would be good CPU benchmarks, and then I think we were still GPU bottlenecked in both of these, but I decided to include them anyway, and I ran all of these at 1080p high settings. But I felt like it was a good example of these memory tests are interesting and trying to optimize and maximize. That's the fun in it, and I'm always searching for a way to, you know, get the tiniest little bit of, you know, better performance. But in reality, if your computer's set up right and you're getting a good gaming experience, memory is almost never a significant bottleneck. So if you look at Returnal, this was 1080p, ray tracing off, high settings, and all the kits fell out very, very close together. Within, you know, the biggest spread here is 3 FPS, and the 1% lows is like 2 FPS. So for all intents and purposes, you'd be well off with any of these kits. And then Total War, Warhammer, whenever I'm doing any sort of CPU testing, this is memory testing, but it's going to heavily impact the CPU. People always want to see some simulator type games. I don't really have any simulator type games I can easily benchmark. I figured Warhammer Total War would be the closest one. Once again, this was 1080p. I still think we were GPU was just at 100% and it was just doing fine, which is crazy because it just shows you that even with a 4090 at 1080p, you got to be very selective with what games you're trying to actually bottleneck the CPU, because the 9800 X3D so fast, it's just gonna keep up. Even the 4090 can't really cripple it. So I guess we'll have to wait for the 5090 to come out to really start truly getting these tests rolling again. But once again, technically, for the 8000 came out. Actually, he's third place, but they're all within like 1 FPS. It is what it is. So there we go. And I think there's two categories of people on this one. I think that there's the people that are just going to set XMP or Expo. And just to clarify on that, Expo is technically the AMD like protocol, XMP's Intel, but your AMD processor will be able to load up either one. So if you put an Expo kit in and you go to enable it, it's just going to say Expo profile 1 or 2. And then if it's an XMP, it'll say something about like DOCP. And it's just how AMD reads the XMP kits. So that's how that works. I think the only kit that I had that was technically Expo was the 32 gig, and I think the other two were XMP. All of them worked just fine. But so yeah, so category 1 is going to be the individual that just wants to load up the pre-configured settings, and that's the end of it. And then the second group are going to be the people that really want to tune this kit up and try to get every ounce. And I would say that for gaming, you're probably wasting your time because it's never really going to be the bottleneck. And any of these kits would do great because if I actually played, in 1440p or 4K like I wanted, and with the 9800 X3D, there would be almost like no scenario where my RAM was just going to really cripple this thing. But we're enthusiasts, right? So you're probably going to spend the time, if you're in that group, and try to get every ounce out of this thing. Post up your AIDA scores, show people how low you got your latency and how superior your kit is. So if you're in Camp A where you just want to enable Expo, it seems like at this point I would definitely, if you're on a budget, the 32 gigs is going to be fine. But if you're buying a 9800 X3D, you're probably not on a super confined budget because you're buying the fastest gaming CPU in the world, and you're probably just looking for top performance. So I would definitely go for the 64 gig kit, and then I would just price out, do you want to get a 6000 kit or do you want the 6400? Their performance was relatively comparable. I think in real world applications, you would never see a difference. That gets more into if you're wanting to tune it. I think that becomes more apparent because you can take one of two strategies. You can go for the 6000 and try to really whittle the latency down. I think at this point, people on the Hynix sticks have been able to get 6000 CL28 pretty consistently. And then when you go in and start really tweaking all the subtimings, you can start getting that latency really, really, really low. Or you can go the other route and kind of be, proud of your new CPU that can handle it ideally, and you can run the DDR5 6400. And all three 9000 series processors that I've had, because I've seen some people being like, oh, it's not guaranteed and like it's not working for me. I'm 3 for 3. I've had the 9600X, 9950X, and my 9800X 3D. I've been able to do 6400 with mem clock equal to U clock. So what that's going to do is it's going to put your memory controller at 3200 megahertz, and every one of my 9000 processor CPUs has been able to do that. And I think that would be a good sweet spot. And ultimately what I'm going to try to do, once again, this is a typo, it's 6400 CL32, not 30. That's kind of what I'm shooting for. This is the kit I purchased. Spoiler alert, it's ultimately the one I'm going to run with. And I'm going to spend the next couple days trying to really tune this kit to try to get the advantage of both worlds. I want to be able to run my memory controller at 3200 for the 64 kit, and I want to try to get this latency as low as physically possible for that excellent gaming performance. And I think because like we showed, the games, some of them prefer frequency and some of them prefer latency. I think this will be the best of both worlds where you'll capture the widest scope of games once you get this kit tuned. And then ultimately, the 48 gig kit, there was a couple times it was kind of like, hey, I'm hanging in there. But to me, it's just not worth the effort because you're going to need a little bit of a nicer motherboard probably. Like, I bet a lot of the entry-level motherboards would have trouble running this because I even had to play around with it a little bit on my Mag Tomahawk to really get it stable. And the Hero motherboard, it didn't seem to have any sort of problem except for that one test where I had the Infinity Fabric higher. It kind of Uno reversed and the performance went down, where in all other cases the Infinity Fabric helped. So I bet I was having a little bit of stability issue there. But that's the whole point, is these high frequency kits, you're going to have to tweak them a lot more. And who knows, if I really tuned this thing, maybe I can get the latency down and maybe it would be the Hero after all. But to me, the juice isn't worth the squeeze right now on the AMD platform, at least in the single CCD. So the reason why I bought these is for the dual CCD processor that I have. So now that I have these 3 kits, I'm probably going to go through and do this exact same testing on my 9950X to see if the results are any different, because I would hope on that CPU with the dual CCD that the megahertz would actually help out a little bit more on it. That's my theory that I've been pushing for, but I haven't gone in and fully tested it. So if that's something you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. But that's that kit's going to go back in the 9950 system, and the 6400 DDR5 6400 is going to go back in my 9800 X3D, or that's what's in it right now. And I'm just going to continue to tune it to try to get the best of both worlds. And then I think it's just going to be time that I retire my old 32 gig kit, unfortunately, which makes me a little sad because it's been hanging with me since AM5 released. But that's kind of where I'm at. So for probably 95% of people, I would buy at least a 64 gig kit. And I would get either, your choice. If you really, really want to tune, I'd probably get the 6400 and try to get the latency down. Or if you just want to play the safest bet possible, I'd probably just get the 6000. Just make sure that you're buying those, CL30 type kits. I still see people, posting up like CL36 or something like that kits. And we just showed latency's huge for AMD. So don't mess that up. And then as far as the pricing goes, I started talking about that, but I fell away. Yeah, the 32 gig kit, this is like bang for the buck value. If I was going with like the 9600 build, I'd probably do this because I'm much more value conscious. If I'm going for an all-out build, I'm going to be here in the middle looking at this like 179. And then as we saw, at least on this processor, this is just not really going to be worth it at the 249. I'll be interested once they come out with the new CU DIMMs that are going up to like almost 10,000 megahertz. I'll be interested to see if those are actually worth it. But I have this feeling that the latency and timings are just going to go up in order to facilitate that, and it's just going to be a wash again, is kind of what I'm thinking the situation will be. But you don't know until you test it. So that's kind of where I'll leave it on that one. Hopefully you enjoyed the content. If you did, give me a like and hit the subscribe. And if you have any tips that you want to pass along, just leave it down in the comments as well. Hope you have a good time gaming.